Welcome to the Kennedy School for the first of a series of events dealing with hunger and asset development. I'm Julie Wilson, Director of the Malcolm Weiner Center for Social Policy. I'm actually not a part of this event. I'm merely here to introduce the whole series of events and then turn the program over to Marty Chen. But what I would like to do is to tell all of you about the upcoming events, tonight's program on the challenge of hunger, Fridays on asset development for the poor, a program that's going to be looking at micro-businesses, micro-enterprise. Next Tuesday, a program on race and wealth. The following Wednesday, I guess Wednesday, April 24th, what works best in fighting hunger and poverty in the U.S. We're always looking for best practice, how to actually do something about the problems we're getting so good at diagnosing. And finally, on April 29th, micro-enterprise development for the poor in the U.S. These should all be spectacular panels on very important topics, and I would like to encourage all of you to come. I would also like to encourage all of you to participate in the Walk for Hunger. If you are not a Boston native, then you don't know about this rather remarkable event. Every year, thousands of people gather at the Park Street station, walk across the green, and begin walking 20 miles, having collected all sorts of pledges, and the money goes to provide food for the homeless shelters, the pantries in the greater Boston area. I've walked for many, many years, and this year I am here to formally challenge the Center for Business and Government to see which center, the Center for Business and Government or the Malcolm Weiner Center for Social Policy, can raise the most money. Now, we've thought about this for a while, and is Roger Porter here? I talked to Roger. I told Roger if he couldn't make it, our theme was going to be Where's Roger? And he would see it all over the Kennedy School until May 5th. So we now have a theme. I have Roger's walking papers, and I've pledged some money for Roger already. We've decided that the Center for Business and Government doesn't know a lot about poverty, but they do know a lot about money. And the Weiner Center knows a lot about poverty and not much about money. So the final will be the amount of money raised times the number of people who walked. We figure that'll give us a little chance here. So I don't know if there's anybody here from the Center in Business and Government who can take Roger's walking papers to him. Is there anyone here? Well, I'll personally deliver them to Roger. He knows it's coming. I would like to encourage all of you to come. The Walk for Hunger really is a remarkable Boston event. I think next to the 100th running of the marathon, this is what, the 27th, 29th? 27th walking of the Walk for Hunger. So, Marty. And could I also say thank you to Dan Chapman and Ray Bashara for all of their hard work and the other people in the Help Pick who've worked with you to pull all this off. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julie. My name is Marty Chen, and I was asked by Ray and other members of the student interest group, what is called a PIC at the Kennedy School, in this case the Help PIC, to moderate this panel. And it's my pleasure to welcome you here this evening, to welcome our speakers, and to introduce the topic. We are talking today about a really important critical challenge as we near the end of the century. This is the challenge of hunger in the contemporary world. There are fierce debates surrounding this issue, surrounding the questions of who, why, what to do about hunger. How many hungry people? We know that there are estimates that 1.3 billion people are poor, which means that they're either hungry or they stand the risk of being hungry. We know that 1 in 3 people in the developing world is poor or probably hungry. Why do they go hungry? There's where the debate is the fiercest. Some people blame population. Others say it's due to natural disasters and failure of crop production to keep up with the numbers of people in the world. And others, and I'm sure they're members of the panel here, will talk about other causes of hunger, which are much more man-made, have something to do with politics, have something to do with power. And we do know that some people, in fact, go hungry because there is limited food available at the local level. We also know that many people go hungry when food is available. Who goes hungry? Again, debates. It's very hard sometimes to actually pinpoint the pockets of hunger in different communities. Who within a household, for instance, is going hungry if the household itself is doing reasonably well? And can we do something about it? There's another debate about this. There was a conference not too long ago at Harvard on who will feed China, with the underlying question being, can we feed China? And also the question of, can we feed the world? And I think there is a broad consensus that we can produce enough food to feed China and the world. The real question that others will ask is, what are we doing about the distribution of food and about the ability of people to command food? And then the questions are, what can we do? And certainly those answers range from sort of giving away food to helping people produce food, or to helping people command food. And we tend to know more about giving it away, a little bit less perhaps about producing it, and even less about how to enable people to command, to have the resources, both economic and political, to command food. So the purpose of today's session really is to explore these issues, to consider the persistence and the pervasiveness of poverty as we near the turn of the century, and to consider strategies to fight hunger. And to look within that at the roles for government, for non-governmental organizations, and for the private sector in fighting hunger. Today's speakers are eminently qualified as both activists and experts to help us consider these questions. And we have three speakers who will speak on the international level, the global stage issues of hunger, at the national level, and at the local state level. So let me introduce our first speaker, who will speak on international hunger issues. This is John Hammock, who currently is the visiting scholar at the School of Nutrition, Science, and Policy at Tufts University, and he's helping them develop a famine center, actually, for the study of disasters, emergencies, and famine. However, formerly, and this is the capacity in which I came to know him, he was the president of Oxfam America, which I'm sure most of you know is a Boston-based organization which funds self-help development around the developing world. And in that capacity, he had a lot of first-hand experience in countries ranging from Ethiopia to Cambodia with famine, but also with issues of chronic hunger. On a personal note, he was my boss for 7 or 8 years. When I was Oxfam America's field director in India, covering India and Bangladesh. And so I had the privilege of hosting John Hammock on a field visit to India. And another member of the Harvard community, who may or may not be here, was then at Oxfam as well. That's Florence Ladd, who's the director of the Bunting Institute. So she was part of that field visit. Before that, before being president of Oxfam America, he was executive director of Axion International, which I know was featured in a recent conference here on financing development as a pioneer organization on microfinance. So he comes with a great deal of expertise in economic and community development. And so here to tell us about hunger internationally is John Hammock.
Thank you. Thank you, Marty. It's always good to come back to Harvard because I get to see Marty again. In 30 years, we have gone from the national war on poverty to the worldwide war on the poor. People who are poor today are in deep trouble. Indicators show that the poor are poorer, that the rich are richer in country after country in this globe. And this isn't only true in places that you would expect, where there's been a total breakdown of order in food production, like North Korea, or Bosnia, or Rwanda, or Burundi. No, I'm talking even of the countries that I just visited in the last 2 months, Mexico and Venezuela, countries that are not considered poor. But if we look beneath the surface, the level of poverty in those countries is appalling. And the poor in those countries are stuck. In the 1990s, to be poor means that there is no hope for your children. Why is this? I want to make it very clear that it's not because of the floods or the earthquakes or typhoons or tidal waves. People are not poor because they're lazy, because of their race. People are poor because of politics and policies put in place by people like you and me, by governments, international agencies, and often exacerbated by work and policies and practices of non-government agencies and others who are trying to so-called help the poor. Let's take a look quickly at some of the examples. Agriculture. The best land of Africa goes for what? It goes for export agriculture. Export crops that create dollars for the economy, but do not create food for people. Export crops that create dollars for the elite, but which often throw small farmers off the land and lead to poverty. Export crops so that you and I can have our tea and our coffee and our sugar and our bananas for breakfast, but which do not put food, rice, and beans on the table of people in the countries where they're produced. But it goes beyond that. Agricultural policies which favor large producers, corporate producers at the expense of small farmers, who are the backbone of food agriculture production in Africa. Agricultural policies which throw small farmers off the land, often justified by experts like you and me, because they are considered, quote, inefficient, defined, of course, by our standards, relegating them to a world of landless peasantry or slum dwelling from which they will not escape. But it goes beyond that. If you look at the countries with the largest problems of hunger, you will find war. War and armaments do not only gobble up resources. The people who die in wars are not the rich. The refugees, because of war, that travel to other countries to find refugee camps are not the rich. The rich that flee end up in Miami, sometimes here at Harvard. The people who are maimed and have their legs blown off by landmines are not the rich. It is the small farmer who then can no longer farm. And there are more landmines, more refugees than ever before. There are more guns flowing into poor countries today than ever before. Is it any wonder that countries are being torn apart when you consider the amount of arms flowing into them? But it goes beyond that. You have to look at the international economic policies of the World Bank and the IMF. If you are a country and you want to play in the international system, i.e. you want to trade, you have to accept the World Bank and the IMF. You have to accept their conditions for their loans. And these conditions are very clear. Cut government spending. First thing that goes is health and education, which means clearly that the poor are out of it in terms of health and education. Other conditions include privatization and paying back the large debt, which most countries recklessly incurred, and which are taking up 50% of most countries' capacity to pay. Most countries are near bankruptcy. They have to accept the terms of the IMF, and they perpetuate the need for loan repayment, and that in itself continues to beggar them further. But it goes beyond that. Now the world, pushed by the industrial North, has accepted that there is only one economic model, the unabashed free market system. Unbridled capitalism is now touted. Don't worry about a thing. It's all going to be okay because now we've got the free market. Tell that to a poor person. Just today on NPR, grain reserves are the lowest in this country in years. And if we have a bad crop this year, not only will there be no surpluses to use for food aid, but we may in fact have our own food scarcity. This year, not in 7 years after all the government programs are cut. But we are exporting the free market as our gospel truth. And we, the northern elite, have bought into it totally. The free forces of the market will not take care of poverty, will not take care of hunger. But people say, don't worry, if there's a glitch in the market, we'll have more nonprofits, we'll have more 1,000 points to light, we'll have more handouts, don't worry about a thing. That's not a solution. That's perpetuating people for a life of poverty forever. Give them a handout, keep them quiet, and if they don't stay quiet, strengthen the police. So hunger and poverty come from policies which policymakers like you and me put in place. But I want to go beyond that. I believe we're in a period of intense change worldwide. Everything is in flux from the end of the Cold War to the challenge of the very notion of the nation state. It seems that constant change is perpetual, and this breeds nervousness. The uncertainty of modern economics, people just lost their job next door, of globalization makes people confused and nervous and scared. So what happens? People react by being more greedy, by taking care of number one, to exclude others, to build up walls around themselves, to protect what they've got. Away with tolerance. In fact, if the problem is not there, it's their problem, not my problem. So we willfully are part of a culture of contentment. Also, we tend to gravitate towards simple solutions to make sense of this mess that we're in. Fundamentalist religion, fundamentalist politics, fundamentalist me-first economics, and you build a moral wall around yourself to say, convincing yourself that the poor are the problem. They're bad, they're drug addicts, they're lazy, and we're right. Now we have an option, you and me. We can join the worldwide economic war on the poor. We have an option. We can turn our backs on the poor. We can pretend that they don't exist. We can pretend that those refugee camps are not there. We can pretend that if the poor just worked harder, they would make it just like I'm making it. We have an option. We can go our own merry way, not give it much thought, and hope that the lid can get kept on safely. Or we can say no to those values. We can say no to the economic system which oppresses poor people. And we can say that in a period of change, we've really got to have a clear sense of who we are and what our values are. Values of compassion, of dignity, of affirming diversity, of tolerance, of social justice, of some semblance of equity, and yes, of love. My humanity is reflected in those values. If you have those values, you've got to act on those values. You can send money to Oxfam. You can send money to Project Bread. You can volunteer at the Lutheran Church down the corner, which has a homeless shelter. You can get involved in hunger banquets. You can educate yourself, become aware of the situation, not to accept facile answers. You can get involved in local politics. You can get involved in policy making. You can challenge politicians. And first and foremost, you can start with yourself, and I can start with myself. For transformation has to start with how you live your own life, the values you have in your own relationships, being responsible for your own culture, your own life. And if you're in a business, trying to move it towards social responsibility. If you're in a university, trying to move it towards socially responsible practices. So there are things that we can do at our own level. There's a lot going on. And let me end by saying that at the community level, both overseas and here, there are agencies working to bring about change. I'm not hopeless. People are helping to build civil society. There are people trying to link peasant cooperatives to international markets. There are people trying to develop new ways of looking for development assistance and humanitarian foreign disaster assistance. These things do make a difference. I believe we can and we must engage in the worldwide war, but we must opt to do it on the side of the poor. I believe we can and we must, through development aid, through disaster assistance, through policy work, challenge people to do not only what's right, but to challenge conventional solutions which haven't worked and come up with new ones. New paradigms, alternative visions for society so that we can eradicate hunger and poverty. I don't buy the fact that we have to lessen our vision. We must join the worldwide war, but not against the poor, but for the poor. This is the challenge that I see before us as we head towards the end of this century and the beginning of the new one. Thank you.
Thank you, John, for Larry, putting the challenge squarely in our laps, because I think that's where we have to start, and we'll now turn to Larry Brown, who's the director of the Center on Hunger, Poverty, and Nutrition Policy at Tufts University. He's the former chairman of a physicians' task force on hunger in America, which found, actually, that 20 million U.S. citizens are suffering from hunger. He was also the former chairman of the USA for Africa Medical Task Force, and he's the recent author of a book called Living Hungry in America, of which I'm sure he's going to speak tonight. He's also something of a, I believe, a national TV personality. He's frequently on Nightline, The Today Show, Good Morning America, and the McNeil Lehrer Show, if that's what it's still called. And we have the good fortune of having him here tonight at the ARCO Forum at the Kennedy School. So let us welcome Larry Brown, who will speak about, I think, hunger at the national level.
Thank you, Marty. Ladies and gentlemen, the international face of hunger is different than that presented in the United States. In the international arena, despite the heavy forces at work that John described, even among people, pardon me, even among people who don't care so much, hungry people typically are seen as victims. I'm happy to be here. I'm not choking up about it. Well, 3 days I've been carrying my water with me. We think of third world people, people in nations of the South, as being victims more than we think of people who are hungry and poor in the United States. Here we have a love-hate relationship. Certainly some of us feel compassion, but there is a strong ethos expressed in the political arena as if people who are hungry and who are poor are defective people who come from pathological families and pathological backgrounds. A second way that the face of hunger domestically presents itself differently from in the international arena is that we all are used to seeing pictures of children with thin limbs and big tummies, advanced states of malnutrition called kwashiorkor or marasmus. We seldom see that in the U.S., although it is here some, but that is not at all the picture of it. Here we see what the World Health Organization calls silent undernutrition. Children who are skinny, but oftentimes even pediatricians do not pick it up. Children have clothes here. We don't see their bodies so easily. And a third way that it presents itself differently is that in the nations of the South, each day between 30 and 40,000 children die directly of hunger-related diseases. That happens a bit in the U.S., but they're isolated cases. Children typically do not die. They are crippled subtly and indirectly from hunger, but the manifestation is not quite so stark. Yet, despite the different pictures of hunger internationally and domestically, there are similarities. Nobody can be deprived or fail to get an adequate diet over a long period of time on a chronic basis and not suffer adverse health outcomes. In third world nations, it may be blindness. In the United States, it may be vitamin deficiencies which impact cognitive capabilities. In other ways, there are similarities: stunted bodies and stunted lives. Children who don't grow on the normal growth curve that pediatricians typically monitor children on a cross-cultural basis. Another similarity is that while there's a lot of knowledge about hunger, both in nations of the South and in the U.S., we don't typically do very much about it. We debate it, we measure it, we study it, we come to forums to talk about it, but we're typically not in any danger of lessening the problem. And that leads to a final similarity, and that is that there's a moral dimension. Hunger amidst an adequate food supply. I'm talking not only about the U.S., where we clearly have enough money to feed all of our people, and most of the rest of the world. But I'm talking about the fact that in virtually every nation of the South, there is an adequate food supply as well. It may not be at the local level, certainly not, it's not at the household level, but there is enough food. So we have to dispense with the fact that inadequate food supply is the source of hunger itself, is a source of hunger in the world. The dimensions of hunger in the United States are debatable. Nobody has an adequate number. Our center right now is doing a joint project with Apt Associates. We were selected by USDA to develop a federal hunger measure like the poverty measure developed by Molly Orshansky 30 years ago and still used by the federal government. Starting next year, we will have an annual hunger measure in the United States. Hunger we typically define as a chronic underconsumption of adequate food and nutrients. The measurement of which is defined by the National Academy of Sciences in terms of recommended dietary allowances. Several years ago, for a congressional committee, we estimated that the 20 million figure that we had projected in 1985 when I was at Harvard School of Public Health was now up to 30 million. Not because I left Harvard and went to Tufts, but simply because with the downscaling of the economy, more and more people, families in the United States, were living on the brink. I think that we are now entering a new era in terms of domestic hunger, not because of what's manifest in the policy debate in Washington, but because of the scientific evidence that is coming out. We have compelling new evidence that we did not have 10 years ago, or even 7 years ago when I left Harvard. In the medical area, about 60% of my students were from the medical school. The others were from the School of Public Health. And I remember that I used to teach them that the scientific evidence about the impact of undernutrition on brain development was that there had to be gross deficiencies over a long period of time, and it directly impacted the morphology or the structure of the brain. That still is true, but it's truth with a small t and not truth with a capital T. There is a body of scientific evidence which has emerged over the last 12 to 14 years, which shows that even mild undernutrition, the kind that we have in the United States, produces cognitive impairments in children, which if uncorrected, which if allowed to attend, will last a lifetime. In other words, people's innate abilities, or to put it in other terms, their God-given capabilities, will not be manifest because these children experiencing hunger at an early age are delivered to a schoolhouse door with one arm tied behind their backs. And we know that there is a more circuitous route to the way that undernutrition impacts cognitive development. We used to think, as I said, that it was directly through brain morphology. We now know that the body in an undernourished state goes through a method of triage. Obviously, the mind is not conscious of it. Obviously, the human being is not willful in doing it, but it's the body's way of protecting itself. When there is inadequate dietary energy, the triage system of the body operates like this. The limited energy that exists goes for critical organ function. In other words, to keep the organism alive. If there is enough energy, dietary energy left, the next stage in the triage system is that it goes for growth and maintenance of the organism. That is why hungry children literally will stop growing, will experience growth failure. They're short for their ages, they weigh too little, short for their height and weigh too little for their ages on normal standardized growth charts. And finally, whatever dietary energy is left, the last priority is for interaction with the environment, which leads to cognitive development. The hungry child sitting in a classroom, you have her body, but you don't have her mind. She literally is not engaging with her peers, with the educational process, with her teacher, with her parents. And it is through this more circuitous route, rather than direct impairment of brain morphology per se, that we now know that cognitive impairment is a direct outcome of even mild undernutrition, both in the United States and in developing nations. Now think about it. The implications of this body of evidence are highly significant. We spend billions of dollars every year, federal government, state government, and particularly local governments, in investing in the education of our children. By letting children come to school hungry, be hungry in their early years of life, and come to the schoolhouse door hungry, we are losing significant amounts of our educational investment because the children are not prepared for the educational process. What's the next implication? In terms of productivity. At a time in which it is becoming increasingly difficult in the international market, when the United States has to compete at the high end of the scale with the Germanys and Japans of the world, we're not going to be competing with the Mexicos of the world. We need all the highly skilled and well-trained minds that we can get in the knowledge-based competition in the world order. We are going to have a less productive workforce because we have such a high level of poverty and hunger in the United States. 12 million children hungry, 15 million in poverty. And finally, our competitiveness in the world order will suffer. I think that this body of evidence has a capability to significantly broaden the issue of hunger from that of a moral base to that of a significant economic issue as well. For people who are not moved simply by the morality of the problem, and having dealt with many members of Congress, I can tell you that they're not. The fact that it has such an economic impact, the fact that it speaks to the competitiveness of the U.S., the hard-edge issues, gives us the capability of motivating our country to do something about it. Finally, as I close, an example. A couple of years ago, I took 3 CEOs all day long to Capitol Hill to meet with a number of members individually. Alan Hassenfeld, the CEO and chairman and CEO of Hasbro, Arnold Hyatt, the former CEO at Stride Rite, and Bill Woodside, the former CEO at Prudential, at American Can, which became Primerica, and now the CEO at Sky Chefs. They went to Capitol Hill, 2 of them Republicans, 1 a Democrat, to meet individually with Bob Dole, to meet at the time with several Democratic senators, to meet with Chafee, another Republican, to tell them of their concern, both about the moral issue of hunger, but about the fact that America is not going to have its leadership in the world, its moral authority in the world, so long as we carry the weight of 21,000 handgun deaths a year, 19th in infant mortality, 12 million children going hungry. That as business leaders, they believe that Congress has to quit ducking this issue. It's a baseline or sentinel indicator, and that we have to do better in the public policy arena. I think we will. The crowd in Washington that was elected last time around came in, as you know, with plans to cut school lunches and school breakfasts and so on. They got soundly defeated on that. Ultimately, they will not win on the larger issue of ignoring hunger and poverty in America, because it is in the self-interest of this nation, left and right, Republicans and Democrats, to get our house in order so that we can both make it our nation stronger for itself and to have more impact in the international arena. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry, for putting a human face as well as some science around the whole question of hunger. Ellen Parker of Project Bread was to have been here tonight, but she is at a memorial service for Lee Jackson, who was with Ron Brown in Croatia. And she sends her regrets, and she sends in her stead Esther Hainig, who is the Director for Public Policy and the Child Nutrition Programs of Project Bread / The Walk for Hunger, which is the state's largest private nonprofit devoted to alleviating, preventing, and ending hunger in Massachusetts. She oversees Project Bread's summer meals and school breakfast outreach programs, and she also develops and implements hunger policy on both a grassroots level and with state and federal legislatures. The Massachusetts Childhood Hunger Relief Act is largely due to Esther and her energies. In 1991, she participated in the implementation of a landmark study on childhood hunger in Massachusetts, and the study found that nearly 200,000 children are hungry or at risk of hunger in Massachusetts. So here then to tell us about hunger in our own community, in our own back door, is Esther Hainig. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have to agree with John. We are indeed living in changing volatile times today, and we indeed are seeing what happens when there's this kind of fear and uncertainty. And as I was thinking about coming here today, I was thinking about the word challenge. And indeed, the thing about the word challenge is it talks both about difficulty, but also about possibility. And clearly the times that we're living in bring great difficulty and great challenge, but I think also, as John alluded to, they also bring great opportunities and that we can take advantage of. But one of our biggest challenges, as already been mentioned, is really making people aware that hunger does exist in the United States, and certainly in Massachusetts. We're seen as a very, very rich state. And when we read the newspapers today and we watch television, we hear all the time about the economic recovery we're seeing. But what we do see at Project Bread is we see less and less of that economic recovery. It was easier in the early 90s to get the idea across that hunger exists. First, we had the study that showed the prevalence of childhood hunger in Massachusetts, but we also had the recession. So many, many people knew people who were out of work for the first time, and they could agree there was hunger. But now when we have a 5% unemployment rate, it's very, very difficult to get that message across. But what's happening today, as has already been mentioned, and it's certainly very, very true in Massachusetts, which is very much an information economy, is that there are fewer and fewer jobs available for people with little education and little job experience. And those are people that are hungry. We're also hearing on our food source hotline where people can come in and call for help with food emergencies that many, many of the people who were unemployed during the recession have found jobs. But I really mean jobs. I mean that in the plural. They found 2 or 3 jobs that even with the 2 or 3 jobs are not replacing the salaries that they had before and don't carry the benefits with it that they have before. So they still are not able to make enough money to meet all their needs, and they need help feeding their families. The other thing we're starting to see is we're really starting to see the effects of downsizing. I was talking to one man in Worcester, and he said for the first time what he's seeing in their pantry is he's seeing men in their 50s coming in, out of work for the first time in their lives, having to ask for help with very little prospect of reemployment. So hunger is really taking on both the same face that it did before, but also it's taking on a new face as well. The other thing that is really impacting hunger in Massachusetts is public policy. That there have been cuts already on the federal level in programs that are less well known, like the Emergency Food Assistance Program and in FEMA programs, and we're already seeing a diminution of food resources from public policies. We're also already seeing in the food pantries people coming in asking for help because they've been cut off of welfare because of the new welfare reform laws. And if even a fraction of the programs, of the cuts that are being proposed, have been proposed in Congress go through, first of all the programs that affect low-income people will affect people's ability to feed their families. What we see at Project Bread is we see that food is always the first thing to go. What you want to do, you definitely want to pay your rent, especially in Massachusetts and the cost of housing. You don't want to be out on the streets. You want to keep your heat going, especially in this winter, and you want to keep your phone and you want to keep your car so that you can get a job. So the first thing to go is always food. So any cuts to low-income programs affect people's ability to eat. And then if there are further cuts, Larry is correct, clearly, as he knows it much better than I, that they have scaled back in what they're proposing to cut on the federal level, but they're still proposing deep cuts to programs like food stamps, which will really, really affect people's ability to eat. Another thing that we find really affects getting the message across that people are hungry in a state like Massachusetts is the whole stigma that goes with poverty. One of our board members said to me the other day, he said, you know, we're seeing now the criminalization of poverty. And it affects both people's willingness to look around and see that people are poor. I know when I was growing up, There was always that feeling that there but for the grace of God go I. And today it's as if people think, well, if I don't notice it, if I don't acknowledge it, then it won't happen to me. So that's really affecting getting it across, making people aware of it, making them hear about it. But the other thing is how the people themselves feel about being poor. That people who have to turn for the first time for food assistance don't want their neighbors to know. There was in Andover, they tried to open a food pantry because they saw that there were many, many people from Andover going to Lawrence for food assistance. But they found that when they opened the food pantry in Andover, people still continued to go to Lawrence because they didn't want their neighbors to know that they were still poor. So we definitely have our challenge ahead in making people aware that hunger exists, that it exists side by side, that it exists in a very wealthy and seemingly very successful state at a time of what seems to be, what appears to be, a period of economic prosperity. And so the real challenge out there is to get that message across, to educate people that hunger does exist and that it exists, as we found in the study that we did of childhood hunger, truly in every corner of our state. And that indeed is a challenge. One of the things that we're seeing increasingly in Massachusetts, and I suspect it's true across the country, is increasing geographic separation between economic classes, so that at one time people all used to live in the same town together, and you'd have the very rich and the very poor, and we still have that a little bit in Cambridge. I don't know for how much longer, but that's becoming increasingly unusual, so that you have in Boston, you have the very poor in the inner city. Then as you go into the rings around, you have the working class. And then the more affluent live further and further away. So you find less and less interaction between people who are wealthy and people who are poor. So giving it a human face, giving poverty, giving hunger a human face becomes increasingly challenging. And then as Larry mentioned, you're combating what is hunger. Because it's hard for people to realize what Larry pictured so well is what the impact of the kind of hunger that we see in Massachusetts is and across the country. So one of our challenges is really making certain that we get that information across, making certain that we get people involved and get the word out. But it's also crucial, I think, to give people a feeling that they can do something about it. I think one of the things that's happened to us over the last few years is this feeling of hopelessness, of you can't do anything about it. And I know as an advocate, you're constantly torn between, on the one hand, you want to brag about how well the programs that we have work. On the other hand, we know they're not adequate. And so you have to hit that fine balance. Because you don't want people to feel hopeless. You do want them to feel there's something they can do about it and there's a way they can get involved. And that's why it's very, very important, I think, to have public policy agendas. To have public policy agendas that are very focused, that are very achievable, and that are bipartisan at this point in time. I actually, in one of my former lives, I worked in the state Senate, and before that, I was a child care advocate. And when I was a child care advocate, I'm very, very good at talking people into doing things. And so I would always talk people into calling or writing their legislators, and I would never do it because I felt I didn't know enough about the issue. Then I became a legislative aide in the state Senate, and I realized, to my amazement, that a very, very small number of phone calls or a very small number of letters can make a huge difference. And so I think it's very, very important that we get that message out. What I learned by working at the State House and why I do this for a living is that democracy works and we just don't use it. So I think, as John mentioned, it's really important that we give people something to mobilize around and that we make sure that they're involved. I think another real challenge that we have today is, first of all, to involve our natural constituency, people who directly are affected by hunger. But it's also a real challenge to broaden that constituency, to bring other people into it, because I think that's where we're going to start to be able to bridge these geographic separations. So it's very important to really broaden the people who are involved, and that's also a way, one, of educating people, and it's also through educating people you bring people in. So I think the other thing that's really important, though, is to make it easy for people to act, to make them feel successful, to give them the tools, to give them what they need to know. But unfortunately, and, you know, I have a price for being here, so, and the reason I have a price for being here is that whatever you need to do fundraising. Because in the short term, what we find at Project Bread, since we fund 477 food pantries, meal programs, and other feeding programs through the annual Walk for Hunger on May 5th, is that in the short term, we need to put food on people's tables, and we also need to be able to have the resources to come up with these agendas, to give people the ways to action, and to make changes in public policy. And to do that, you need money. Well, in this day and age, that's an increasingly difficult thing to do. People are feeling more and more insecure. It's harder and harder to get them to give. The need is becoming much greater. And just let me make a statement right here. The private sector will never, ever be able to do what the public sector can do. That's now with where we're at. And with further cuts, that competition is just going to be greater and harder to really deal with. So it's really, really important. It's really hard to raise the money. But I think it's possible to do it if we educate people, if we get them involved, and I think personal involvement is very, very important. And of course, that's why anybody at Project Bread goes anywhere you ask them in the month of April, because we all have a price. We're out there getting you to walk for the Walk for Hunger. You didn't think that I was going to come here and do a talk on local hunger without doing a plug for the walk. And one of the things I can say about the walk is it kind of does everything I talked about in meeting that challenge. It educates people. It raises money. It involves them personally. And the other thing it does is that for any of you who have been there, it kind of restores your faith in mankind and lets you know and makes you feel that all of this can happen, that within the word challenge, that you can overcome the difficulty and you can truly, truly reach the possibility. So I hope you'll all be there on May 5th. The other thing is, my second plug is, for public policy to get involved in anything that's happening, I do two plugs here, that you'd like to be involved in on public policy, both on Massachusetts and the federal level. I also brought a sign-up sheet, so anybody who wants to be hooked up to that can come over and see me afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Esther, for presenting us with the challenge of making poverty visible in areas of relative prosperity and in times of relative prosperity. And now we turn to what the ARCO Forum is designed to have, which is a question and answer period. There are two microphones. People are asked to ask their questions from there, to identify themselves, and to ask questions, not make comments. Thank you.
Yeah, my name is Kate Callahan, and I'm a student here at the John Kennedy School. I'm a maternal child health specialist and have worked with the homeless for many years. I have to make a comment. The comment is, I can't believe there's a dearth of people here, which lets us know that really people aren't interested in this. But two questions. One, will there be aid stations at the walk? Which is kind of a fun question. Aid stations of food and drink, which I think will be an interesting thing that you might want to feature. Okay, and the other question or comment I have is, I guess it's a question, is to Dr. Brown. When we think about merging private and public, has anyone thought about going to like Kraft Foods, General Foods, Beatrice Foods, having them sponsor a huge forum, inviting the school systems and all systems that in fact can help drive public policy to understand what the problem is all about and to pay for that, and to actually have the people who work with them drive some legislation. And it's like when you sign up for the United Way, which a lot of people do, but they never sign up to write the state legislature about a real problem that is national and international, but it has direct relationship to what they do for a living, which is supply food. So I'm wondering if you could comment on that. that's ever been tried.
Esther, do you want to quickly answer her question about the aid stations?
Well, I do have to say the other thing about the walk that I think I forgot to mention is that we take care of your every need. We have every portable toilet in the state on the walk. We have first aid, we have entertainment, we have free food. This year, halfway through, there's Welch's grape juice, yogurt, and smart food. And so we take care of your every need, and it's fun.
Okay, Larry.
I have a couple of comments to make in response to your good question. One is that there are corporations that already are deeply involved in the issue of hunger. You mentioned one of them, and that's Kraft Foods. There are others as well, but typically what they do is fund direct service organizations and policy analyses. Our center is funded substantially by Kraft Foods, in fact. The reason that they don't get out front more directly on legislation, but will do things, as I had said, about going to Washington with me or speaking to legislators, is because they think that it's a bit unseemly as Fortune 500 companies if they push a public policy agenda so directly, especially those that are food companies, because they will be criticized for having some interest in expanding federal programs because it would feather their own nest. So there's some sensitivity to that. I've been quite impressed, to tell you the truth, with the degree to which corporate leaders are concerned about issues like hunger and poverty and do get out front, both with their money and with their leadership in the way that I mentioned earlier. The second thing to be said is, and William Woodside said it best in an article for Fortune magazine several years ago, do not expect the private sector to pick up the slack from what government is doing. The private sector has its own agenda and its own responsibilities, and the reason that you have government is to provide a moral bottom line. And that even if all of the corporations in America would triple their corporate giving, excuse the expression, but it'd still be like pissing in the ocean. He didn't put it quite that way in Fortune magazine. In terms of the amount of monies that are lost, the federal dollars that are lost. The proposed cuts in federal food stamps, for example, are 7 times the cuts that were enacted in the first 4 years of the Reagan administration by a Democratic Congress and a Republican president. The cuts in food stamps over 7 years would come to about 30 billion meals that would be lost for low-income people. So the private sector, either the for-profit or the not-for-profit, is not the answer here. It's a snare and a delusion.
I'm John Stith. I'm a Master's of Public Policy student here at the Kennedy School. I've read several places that it takes 10 to 15 pounds of grain to produce 1 pound of meat in this country. Yet, and I realize that having more grain by drastically reducing our consumption of meat wouldn't solve the distribution problem, but it seems like it would be a big step towards making food cheaper for everyone around the world. Yet I've rarely heard mainstream hunger groups really push the issue of drastically reducing our consumption of meat. So I'm wondering, is that because you don't think it would make a big difference, or because you think it would be politically unpalatable to the American public?
John?
I think you're right about large organizations not taking that on. I think, first of all, you're correct in saying that it's a very inefficient converter, and clearly not something that should be a major staple in the diet of people if we're going to be efficient in terms of nutrition. That's number one. Number two is, the more difficult question to answer is why nonprofits haven't done it. The only thing I can talk about is Oxfam. We actually looked at that fairly seriously. I looked very seriously at joining the, there was a campaign to stop meat consumption in this country after Jerry Rifkin wrote a book called something like, I can't remember the name of the book. But we looked at it, and we looked at it fairly seriously. We never really looked at it seriously enough to take it to the board, but we basically decided that that was not an issue that we would put our effort on, because we felt that our particular focus was to try to educate people in the policy arena and on other policies. Not because it wasn't an important issue, because it was an important issue, but it just, in terms of where we were, in terms of our focus, in terms of the projects that we had overseas, because we try to do education around issues that came from our overseas work, we were more focusing on other issues, sort of rights of women, the economics, et cetera. So that was the reason at Oxfam. I can't speak further than that.
The direct link between grain production and meat consumption attends far more in the nations of the South than here. But probably in a different way than your question might imply if I read you right. And that is that there is strong evidence that small farmers and the poor in nations of the South suffer because of export crops, which are associated, therefore, with cattle production, and that produces more hunger. There is little, if any, evidence that I know, and I've looked at this fairly carefully, little, if any, evidence that I know that would support the contention that simply eating less meat by itself and therefore having more grain available would dramatically or even significantly reduce hunger in the world. As I said earlier, by and large, most nations have adequate grain supplies, or adequate grain supplies exist in world markets, and that's not really why we have hunger. So I don't mean to dismiss the significance of the issue, but it's through another mechanism that this is important. But I don't think that it's the most important issue I think people ought to reduce meat consumption on the merits of health, not because it will end hunger.
Please.
I'm Dan Chapman. I'm a first-year student here as well. I have two questions. One's for Dr. Brown and then one for the whole panel. You spoke about nutrition being a problem in this country. You quoted a quote of 20 million people being undernourished and maybe 12 million children. I'm wondering how much of that is undernutrition as opposed to too low caloric intake, because that's an issue in Africa where I lived for a while. And the second question is, I would like the panel to address the criticism that I've heard of hunger programs generally. Again, this is from a sort of an African perspective, developmental perspective, that they tend to focus, that tend to foster dependency, and that the resources thereby used up would be better served in development efforts which tend to foster self-sufficiency.
Help me if I didn't exactly get your question right, but it was the distinction between hunger and undernutrition? Okay. Hunger basically is a non-scientific, non-specific term. We use it because it's a term that everybody understands and uses. But when we talk about hunger, what we really are talking about is the chronic underconsumption of adequate nutrients as measured by RDA levels. So, for example, we know pretty well the number of children in America who go hungry because we have a good database from annual surveys that are done on dietary consumptions in households. So we are really talking about dietary intake when we mention hunger, rather than the sensation of, I feel hungry. In fact, many people who are hungry scientifically don't even feel it. That is, they will load up on filling starches and things that are not necessarily nutritionally good for them, because it alleviates the sensation of hunger in the stomach. But from a nutritional dietary standpoint, they are hungry.
And then I would answer the second question fairly briefly by saying that the solution to hunger is not sending food. That clearly is important to deal with the issues of nutrition, but the solutions to hunger is to deal with the broader issues of poverty. And the way you do that most effectively, at least in my experience, is that you deal at the community level through long-term development and empowerment, and actually giving power to people to make their own decisions. And it's not even development, because development, a lot of sins take place under the rubric of development. But it's actually a whole process of how do you get people themselves to organize, to be participant in the process, to take charge of their own lives, and then a foreigner helps in that process that they run and control. But how often have we, even here, really gone to Roxbury and asked people there what they want, and then acted on what they want rather than what we wanted? So I think your second question is absolutely correct. I mean, the problem isn't going to be solved just by food. The nutritional aspects will be solved, but not the longer-term problems of how do you not have to continue to giving food to people all the time.
Larry, you have a postscript there?
Yeah, in the U.S. context, there's no empirical evidence that suggests that food programs promote dependency. In fact, quite the opposite. The number of hungry Americans by various estimates, all of which are pretty much in the same ballpark, but are from different sources, including some on the right, by the way, political right, show that hunger went up dramatically from the mid-1980s to the current time. It wasn't because people suddenly became dependent. It wasn't because people suddenly became pathological. I know you weren't suggesting that, but it's a good question because that notion is out there. We have increases in poverty which parallel increases in hunger, or I should say hunger which parallel increases in poverty. And those in turn both parallel changes in economies. That does not mean that there isn't any pathology in our society. It doesn't mean there's not pathology among some elements of the poor. But there's no reason to believe that there's any more pathology among the poor than there are among the non-poor. It's that the non-poor can hide their pathologies more because they have money. But what's driving this, according to the empirical evidence that exists, are external factors to the individual and to the household, rather than dependency as such.
Esther, did you want to?
Well, I guess the only thing I would say is that part of, when people talk about self-sufficiency, I have kind of a problem with that, but what exactly does that mean? And if you're trying to get yourself out of poverty, whether it's as a child that you're trying to provide, that you need the proper background and education to be able to compete in this global economy, clearly, I think as Larry really showed us, a hungry child can't learn. So I think that it's what comes first, and if you haven't fed people so that they're not able to avail themselves of the means by which they can bring themselves out of poverty, then you're really not, that's really part of self-sufficiency, I would say.
My name is Mary McMahon, soon to be here at the Kennedy School in the mid-career program. First of all, I want to thank you for the presentation. And to all of you, I want to say thank you for the support I've had here, especially in the last year. I'm delighted with some of the steps that Mr. Clinton is taking in terms of preventing the loss of some of these programs. And I want to say thank you. The question I have for you is, it's sort of a second to the question that was just presented. I look with aghast at places like Rwanda and Bangladesh and the other hotspots in the world. You know, aside from the problems that we have here at home, you look at these and you say, how is it possible in this world of airplanes and air flights and all the rest of it, how is it possible that we can't get food to these people? What kind of plan or failure in plan or what is being developed to handle sort of crises and situations like that? I hear Mr. Hammock saying that they're going to be developing, or they're developing plans to have countries grow their own food, and that is the focus of your interest right now, not only supplying them with what they need, but sort of working to help them develop for the future. But even at this time, it seems hard to believe that we cannot get food to those people who need it. And why is there a failure, and what is being done about it? Not only here at home, but you know, in the hot spots like Bangladesh and
yeah. Well, first of all, there, as
North
Larry
Korea
mentioned,
and so forth, yeah.
and I think others, I mean, there's plenty of food. I mean, the problem is not a lack of food. Plenty of food in the United States, but also usually plenty of food right around the corner in the next country or in the next region of the country that's having a problem. So, I mean, that's the first point. Second point, why is it not being distributed? I mean, that is the issue. And I think personally, there are a lot of reasons for that. One of them has to do with the fact that this country does not mobilize resources for a hotspot unless, in fact, there's public pressure to do so. In other words, it has not been my experience that, for example, right now in Rwanda, there's plenty of food, but the pledges that the United Nations has asked for food, for people to give, have been languishing. The United States hasn't given the food that it has been asked, and neither have the European, et cetera, in terms of just food quantities that are required to keep the refugee camps alive, et cetera. So that in part it's because there's a lack of political will. Really, in terms of people, there's plenty of food in this country to send to Rwanda, but there's not the will to do it. There's not the political pressure on the government to do it. And there's also, I think, as Esther was mentioning, it's a very difficult time for private agencies to raise money for this kind of thing. It's become increasingly difficult, I think. Unless it's on TV, people don't think it exists. And Rwanda was on TV for about a week and a half. And a lot of money was raised during that time, and a lot of money was spent within the first month. And after that, it was no longer on TV. It was either solved or it was forgotten. And it was forgotten. And I think that, unfortunately, the media really does drive contributions to nonprofit agencies. And if it's not in the media, it's very hard to get contributions for this. I mean, you do it, but it's not at the magnitude needed to be done.
What can we do to change
I think we
that?
need to.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, probably go on. Yes.
Yeah, that's right. Sorry.
My name is Nessa Richmond, and I'm a first-year student here. I'm wondering if you think there are ways to restructure in the U.S. the agricultural production system in ways that might might have more local agriculture, and in that way alleviate the problem of hunger, and if so, how that could start.
As you probably know, there was a major change, sea change in agricultural policy, which won't be fully manifest for some years now in terms of its outcomes, when Congress recently voted to end the subsidies, agricultural subsidies. It will save about $13 billion a year. The subsidies will not fully end for 7 more years. There's also, I want to say parenthetically, that trade agreements like GATT are going to have a major impact not only on U.S. food supply but on world food supply. We expect it's going to have a negative impact because now then there's more incentives with the market-based system for producers to put those grains on the market. And so grain reserves are going down. And I noticed recently NPR and I think the New York Times covered that issue. That is, even today, one of them, that we're not likely to have the food supplies that the world typically has for crises, and including in the United States. As far as your question about ways that we could change agricultural policy even further to impact hunger perhaps in local communities, I don't think that's, and I may be a little bit blind here, I don't think that's an area that's ripe for having a major impact, but there clearly are some ways. For example, farmers markets are springing up, usually associated with a federal WIC program in a number of communities, which in the summertime months and early fall provides fresh grown local produce, largely in low-end communities for people who typically do not have direct access to it. So it creates additional markets for small farmers, but largely, as you probably know, and the reason that I'm not so optimistic that there's a direct relationship here is that the trend is toward larger and larger farms with family farms going out, and it's due to market forces that are probably only going to get worse in my view.
Hello, I'm Mrs. Stewart and I'm a Bostonian, and this is directed to Dr. Brown and also Ms. Hammock. When people go to the food pantries or approach the social service organizations, if they are white and middle class, they come in for a great deal of skepticism and scorn. And I've watched people going through the Star Market and the Stop and Shop checkout lines with food stamps. And I've heard white men, lower class white men or working class white men, deride the people using food stamps. And I had read in the Wall Street Journal that the number of people in the entire country who are legally eligible for food stamps have not applied for them because of the ridicule. And it's interesting to me that having volunteered all my life in my family, that the social service organizations and their representatives seem only to want to serve the stumble bumps, that if the people who have paid taxes their lives are property owners and have paid for all of these organizations go in to appeal for help, that they are looked down upon and have to go jump all sorts of hurdles. And I'd like you to speak to that because you are talking about the same people who supported these organizations now having to appeal to them for funds.
If I could just, I'm a little unclear. You're saying that you think that many people who are traditionally white or appear to be middle class are not served well by food pantries?
Yes, by food pantries and by public service organizations, Salvation Army, what we call here the Transitional Association. They have to prove themselves far more than the noticeable poor.
I have to be very honest and say I've never heard of this before.
I've observed it myself, and I've seen
I'm
that.
not saying that it doesn't exist. Yeah. I'm just saying that I've never heard about it before.
And I know of neighbors who have not gone to their church food pantries. It's the Andover go-to-Lawrence syndrome, where they haven't even attempted to do that because of gossip and being derided.
The only thing that I would just say is that when we did our study of childhood hunger, one of the things that we did find was on food stamps that people who were on public assistance who were eligible were using food stamps. The majority of people who were not using food stamps who were eligible were those who were not on public assistance or the working poor. And part of the bill that we put through had an outreach program, and what we in order to really figure out how to reach those people, we did focus groups, and clearly stigma is a huge issue. And so what we have tried to do is to put in place public service announcements that try to dispel those images and to address the stigma, but it's very, very difficult. It's
I've
a
seen
very
those
big
public
problem.
service announcements. They usually come like 12:30, 1 o'clock at night.
Larry, you want to add? Or?
Stigma is a tremendous problem with federal programs, and in fact with private nonprofit programs. I've been in about 40 states now with a group of physicians over the last decade or so, looking at hunger and talking to hungry people and going to soup kitchens and schools and clinics and so on. And I can tell you, you go to a family farm where it's gone belly up. They're now renting the farm back. They no longer own it. They can't grow crops because it belongs to the bank, and they've had to sell off all of their animals, livestock. That ruddy farmer would almost bloody well rather die than to swallow his pride and go in and get food stamps and have to tear them out in a grocery store. That's why this EBT, the electronic benefits, where you use a card and you don't know what it is, it could be a credit card, so you don't know if they're on food stamps or not, is a boon. Nationally, only about 63% of people who are eligible for food stamps actually get them. And it's a combination of two things largely. One is that there's a major stigma factor associated with food stamps for the reason that I just mentioned. And secondly, a lot of people are inappropriately knocked out of the system because of some very difficult, I won't go into the details now, but bureaucratic stumbling blocks that were put in place precisely for that reason.
Thank you. Can I ask one thing? You
No,
said
I
about
think,
the poverty level in this state is something like $11,000, and that's not sufficient for one person to live on, and yet that's one of the requirements for applying for help.
Yes, my name is Tashawan Wasurana from Simmons College. I'm sure that everybody in here has seen the homeless people on the street before, and a lot of them ask for the money. And do you think it's right that to give them a money, and or which way is the best way to treat them? Just wonder.
Everybody has a different answer on that one.
That's a hard one.
I think it's a personal decision. I guess I believe in the dignity of people, and so I don't believe it's my right to make choices for other people, so I personally give money.
I give money sometimes, and sometimes I don't. I give it less less often than I do give it. I lived in India, among other places, for a couple of years, where you see people begging all the time, in much more dramatic circumstances, and had to deal with that at a fairly young age. I was a Peace Corps volunteer many years ago in India. But I will say this: when you give money to people, you're responding out of emotion and human compassion, and I encourage it. I'm not saying don't do it, but you also have to realize at the same time that that's going to have not much of an impact at all, and that if you want to eliminate homelessness and reduce hunger and poverty in any nation at all, you have to deal in a much more systemic way with the problem in terms of public policies and issues of income.
Okay. I think we'll have just the rest that are standing, and then we
I'd like to thank all the panelists for their lifelong work on hunger and also for being here tonight. Dr. Brown, almost 10 years ago, you published an article in Scientific American saying that there was a clear correlation between the reappearance of hunger in this country and budget cuts, especially in food stamps and other programs under Ronald Reagan. 3 years later, at Tufts University, a group of national experts issued the Medford Declaration, which I'm sure you've heard of, saying that they believe that hunger in this country could be cut in half.
An architect of it.
that domestic hunger could probably be cut in half if existing federal programs were fully funded. I was wondering if you could talk about what has happened in the 6 years since then in the actual budgets that have taken place under Bush and Clinton. Do you think the promise of the Medford Declaration is still true, that domestic hunger could potentially still be halved in 6 years? And what, if anything, could be done by people at the grassroots to see to it that the goals and the promise of the Medford Declaration is made more public and more viable as a public policy option?
Briefly, the good news is that 4 years ago, we passed the Mickey Leland Childhood Hunger Relief Act, adding several $1 billion over 5 years for federal food programs. Interestingly enough, that is one of the things that got cut in the out years under the budget last year. Right now, we are doing a better job on some programs than others. WIC will reach full funding because it reaches women, infants, and children. There's a good scientific base with good empirical evidence showing its success and its impact. School lunch and breakfast programs are not going to be cut, as I just said earlier when I was standing, because there was such a reaction, and there's pretty good data there. Food stamps is where we're likely to take a big hit, probably $22 to $30 billion over a 7-year period. I think that despite his threats to the contrary, President Clinton will probably sign that because it will be attached to a welfare bill, and politically he wants to be seen as reforming welfare. Although he may veto it if there's such a large cut in food stamps. But right now we are not on a track where we are meeting the goals of the Medford Declaration. Let me put it another way. We can, with existing federal food programs, if we would stop this ideological bickering in Washington between the Democrats and the Republicans, Congress and the White House, we have the programs in place, no new bureaucracies and no new programs, to end hunger over a matter of months. These programs work, there's good evidence that they work, and then we can get on with the issue of how best to deal with economic insecurity in our nation, having resolved that problem. So it's there and it's easy to do. I don't think we're going to do it in the next, before the year 2000, which is what the Medford Declaration had said.
One of the major causes of hunger and poverty, both in the U.S. and overseas, is discrimination and biases against women. How do you see that manifested in the U.S., and what can we personally do to address that problem in the U.S. and overseas?
Well, just very briefly, cornerstone of Oxfam's work is working with women precisely because of what you said. In fact, Marty was instrumental, I think, in moving Oxfam to focus more of its work on women. I think that the manifestations are daily. I mean, but the kind of programs that work are the kind of programs that provide women the resources to be in charge of their own lives. And yet, time after time, the martyrs of the development process are the people who stand up. If a woman in India who's lived in a village for centuries, I mean, in the same economic setting, stands up and says, hey, all of a sudden I'm going to own that cow rather than just milk it, that is a very powerful, powerful statement. It's also very radical, and she is under threat. She has potential, there are all sorts of things might happen to her. I think those of us on the outside have to be very cognizant of the change that we're trying to bring about, and we have to do it by supporting their efforts at their level, at their speed, rather than trying to impose things from the outside. But it's very important for that woman to have the support of outsiders as she takes that path. So on the international side, clearly Oxfam believes fairly strongly, and I concur, that $1 invested in a family, in the woman in the family in Africa is going to impact the family, and is going to have a much greater impact than a program that is not focused on women. At the really grassroots economic level.
All right.
The way that problem is manifest in the U.S., discrimination against women, is the following. It's not so much in federal food programs. In fact, I don't see any evidence of it at all. But it's in the economy. Women still make about 70% of what men typically make. And when you have a class of people in the U.S. that are the victims of downscaling in the economy, now then when you have 80% of the population, the first 4 quintiles of the population, all except the wealthiest, whose income is now less than it was 10 years ago. In other words, they're all losing in real constant or adjusted real dollars. When you have real wages today and hourly wages both, salaries and hourly wages that are less than they were in 1979 in constantly adjusted dollars, you're going to see more people turning up at soup kitchens and food pantries and on poverty or in poverty. Women themselves, because of discrimination in the workplace, inequities in remuneration, are affected even more. We have to increase the minimum wage in America. It is not fair for all of us to engage, to believe in the ethic of the world, and certainly an American ethic of getting into the marketplace and working and being responsible, and then have economic circumstances where people work full-time, they play by the rules, they work full-time, and they come home and they don't even earn enough to get their families out of poverty. You can't have it both ways. So the people who are promoting one are ultimately going to have to say we have to index the minimum wage to inflation so that we don't keep seeing people fall further and further behind, and particularly women.
Well, the two things that come to mind immediately that I would add to that are real education opportunities for women to be able to get better paying jobs. Three things: health insurance so they don't have to worry about their kids, and child care so that they can go out and work and get a living wage.
In the third world, property rights, I would add.
Right, absolutely.
Hi, my name's Kim Collins. I'm a student at Simmons College, and this question was touched on briefly before, I believe, but I want to know, what are your thoughts on how the current welfare reform plan is going to affect the subject of hunger?
Inevitably, if the reforms turn out to be what they seem to be, that is, with greater devolution, greater disparities among states, and with pushing people off the rolls, I can tell you that it's going to increase hunger. Don't forget, because many of you, I'm looking, some of you look my age, and others of you look a lot younger. The reason that these federal programs were federalized in the first place was precisely because states either couldn't or wouldn't protect people. That is a history of the federal food programs, definitely, and it is a history of the federal welfare program. So this is not a new idea. It's an old idea, and there's no evidence to suggest that it's going to work. For those of you who are interested, we did a review of all the empirical evidence over 15 years, looking at the two contentions behind welfare reform. By the way, it isn't just Gingrich. It's Clinton who's advancing these. One is that welfare produces out-of-wedlock pregnancies, and out-of-wedlock pregnancies are behind the increase in poverty in America. There is no empirical evidence. Listen to me. There is no empirical evidence to support either of these contentions. In fact, quite the opposite. So much so that 79 scholars, some here at Harvard, at the Kennedy School, many of them are totally apolitical, but scholars in the area of poverty and welfare, signed a letter to Congress saying you're going off in an area, in a direction where there's no empirical evidence to support your contentions. So we're going to make things worse rather than better. Do we need to get rid of the welfare system as we know it? Yes. Is this true reform that's being discussed? No, it isn't. You're seeing politics and ideology driving this rather than facts.
Thank you. I want to thank the audience first for, I think, a very informed set of questions, and of course our presenters for both an informed and inspiring set of presentations.